January 26, 1945. Holtzwihr, France. The young lieutenant standing on a frozen roadside was a Texas farm boy who had learned to count drought. Years and cattle losses long before he learned to read a map, and now he was counting the silhouettes of German armor moving through the trees. Snow clung to the hedges in crusted seams. The sawtooth ridge line of the Vosges was a hard grey against a low sky. The road cutting through the woods was narrow enough that a wagon team would have struggled to pass another without touching hubs. It was a bad place for infantry to meet tanks, and exactly where the Germans chose to attack. The lieutenant was Audie Murphy of the 3rd Infantry Division, 20 years old and promoted beyond his years because in the winter of 1944 and 1945 the war rewarded people who could solve impossible problems with speed. His battalion had been reduced by days of attrition on a front most Americans now called the Colmar Pocket, a stubborn German bridgehead on the west bank of the Rhine. Intelligence said armor and infantry would probe here, then break for the open ground behind the woods. The American answer on paper involved anti-tank guns and mast supporting fire. Reality was thinner. 2 of Murphy's attached tank destroyers were already disabled by mud and mechanical trouble. One M10 sat askew in a roadside ditch with its engine compartment hit. Black smoke breathing from the grills. The vehicle hulked, but its turret, machine gun, intact. The men around him were tired, cold, and down to belts of ammunition they had counted twice. The thesis of this episode sits in that contradiction between doctrine and circumstance. German armor was moving in strength. Allied infantry without proper guns stood in the way. The solution Murphy chose looked impossible, and yet it worked because he used time, terrain, and communications to turn one man's position into a fire plan that multiplied itself. Across 50 minutes he stalled an enemy assault, called artillery that shattered coordination, and forced tanks to pull back from ground they should have owned. The image that endures is the farm kid on the burning machine rifling belts into a line of grey uniforms until the road became a field of bodies. That image was real, but incomplete. Behind it lay a set of techniques and a culture of improvisation that had been taught, practiced, and shared by soldiers and civilians on both sides of the Atlantic for years. The first numbers anchor the scene. American accounts placed 6 German armored vehicles in the attack force and a reinforced company of infantry, roughly 120 to 150 men. The 3rd Division's artillery fired dozens of rounds in timed concentrations that Murphy adjusted by voice over a field telephone. His Medal of Honor citation would later estimate that he killed or wounded 50 enemy soldiers and helped break the attack. None of that reaches the 300 tanks of legend attached to civilian heroics. But the gap between myth and fact tells us something more interesting. When you examine how armor actually died in Western Europe, you find the decisive attrition came from layered systems, often enabled by people who began the war as civilians and applied knowledge the battlefield had not yet learned to value. The first of those civilians was the kind the title promises. Not a folk hero with a rifle, but a farmer whose entire life taught him how to shape ground. 2 summers earlier, on the other side of France, American units learned that the Normandy bocage turned tanks into loud, blind animals. High hedgerows, rooted in earthen banks 2 or 3 feet thick, resisted ramming and exposed an attacker's belly plate when a driver tried to climb through. German gunners waited 30 or 40 meters back on the far side, aiming at gaps with pre-sighted fields of fire. Casualty reports from June 1944 showed American armor losses spiking in hedgerow assaults, and the tankers complained that doctrine written for open country had little to say about 5-ton walls of roots and clay. In that crisis, a National Guardsman who had been a peacetime welder listened to a hedgerow farmer explain how a plow cuts sod without riding up. The Guardsman was Sergeant Curtis Coulin of the 2nd Armored Division. The farmer was a Norman who had spent his life turning soil too stubborn for light tools. Together with a handful of mechanics, they welded steel prongs cut from German beach obstacles onto the lower front of a Sherman, creating a hedgerow cutter that bit the bank and shoved it down rather than riding over. Field trials showed the modified tank could punch a hole in 10 seconds, that infantry could flood through before the defender could shift fire. Within weeks, several divisions had fitted hundreds of cutters. The result was not a miracle that destroyed enemy armor on contact. It was more specific. By lowering the time to breach from minutes to seconds, the cutters reduced exposure to pre-sighted anti-tank guns and allowed combined arms teams to enter fields where bazooka men could get within lethal range. The normalized effect shows in the figures from July to August 1944. In the first 2 weeks after D-Day, some American battalions reported losing upward of a dozen tanks per day in failed hedgerow attacks. After widespread adoption of the cutter during Operation Cobra, daily loss rates fell, and German reports from Panzer Lehr and 2nd SS Panzer note a rise in close assaults against turret flanks, the kind achieved when infantry and armor moved together rather than one after the other. The farmer's insight into how to break soil translated into hundreds of small tactical victories that combined to attrit German armor at scale. A second civilian contribution looked even more impossible when first proposed. Before the war, a British gunnery expert, trained as an engineer, argued that tracer discipline and rapid correction could let guns hit moving targets without elaborate instruments. His name was Frederick Pyle, and while he wore uniform, he cultivated civilian shooters and mathematicians who thought about feedback in non-military terms. In the United States, similar problems brought in graduates from Midwestern land-grant colleges whose peacetime jobs involved keeping power lines stable and grain silos ventilated. When anti-aircraft developers built gun directors using servo mechanisms and analog computers, they were importing the logic of farm pumps and factory governors into a world that thought in tables and set pieces. That same technical culture produced the plainest anti-tank weapon of the war, the bazooka, a tube married to a shaped charge. Engineers Hopkins and Edward Ohl turned a laboratory explosive lens into something a farm kid could carry, and the physics that let a copper cone focus explosive energy into a jet capable of piercing armor was explained. 2 units using analogies with plowshares and seed drills. By the summer of 1944, bazooka teams trained to crawl inside 30 meters of German armor from the angles the hedgerow cutters could open. And after-action reports show that when the weapon failed, it was more often due to standoff distance or poor angle than to raw penetration limits. None of these people were in uniform because they loved war. They were in uniform because their sense of tools and material made them valuable. If you spoke to the shop foreman from Texas who had spent a decade repairing harvesters, he understood the difference between torque that lifts and torque that cuts. He knew how to build a bracket that would shear clean when overloaded rather than tear a machine apart. On hedgerow lanes, that knowledge saved steel and lives. Audie Murphy's name anchors this narrative because it gives the human weight the audience expects. But the heart of the episode rests on the intersection between improvisation and communications. When German infantry crossed the open snow at Holtzwihr, Murphy's first act was not to climb a burning vehicle. It was to call for artillery. He fed corrections that walked rounds through the tree line until he could hear the shock of splinters following each burst. Battery logs from that morning record rapid adjustments keyed to simple references. Not map coordinates, but words like the barn, the ditch, the fork. In farm country, those words had precise meanings. A ditch was not a wash or a culvert. It was a man-cut trench that drained a field and often ran straight. The fork was where 2 tracks met, and anyone who had hauled hay knew how far you could drag a wagon before a horse balked at a grade. That shared language shortened the loop between observer and gun, and each shortening bought time. Time let the defenders make an enemy attack arrive piecemeal rather than in mass. That is the essence of an impossible strategy that works. You do not destroy power head on. You fold the timeline until the strong arrive at different hours. When armor finally closed on Murphy's position, the famous act occurred. He climbed onto the damaged tank destroyer, turned the turret machine gun, and fired across an arc that pinned the leading German squads at ranges under 100 meters. He was hit by shrapnel, but stayed on the gun until the ammunition belts ran low. Then he stepped off and organized a counterattack that cleared the woods the artillery had already thinned. Reports from the German side suggest that the armor did not press through because coordination had broken and their infantry screen was gone. A tank in trees without infantry is a vulnerable box, and German crews knew it. They backed away to avoid being stranded blind among enemies with rockets. Later, readers turn that prudence into more drama than it needs. No tanks brewed up at his muzzle. Yet his use of the burning machine as a fighting platform mattered. A turret ring sets a field of fire above the height of brush, and the machine gun's cyclic rate puts a steady ceiling over ground an assault must cross. The farmer's son understood fields, and he flattened his enemies with a field of bullets. One of the persistent myths that grew from this and similar episodes insists that a handful of civilians destroyed hundreds of tanks outright. The numbers do not bear it out, and honesty demands we say so. But if you trace the attrition of German armor from Normandy to the Rhine, and count not vehicles burned on the day, but vehicles written off over the campaign, you find that the steady work of adaptation, enabled by citizen soldiers and the civilians who taught them to look at machines, differently accounts for losses measured in the hundreds. In Normandy, the 21st Panzer Division reported losing nearly 100 tanks and assault guns during June and July. A mix of combat kills and breakdowns that could not be recovered under fire. Panzer Lehr bled down from more than 200 armored fighting vehicles in early June to a few dozen by late July. In the Ardennes, the 2nd Panzer Division's attempt to reach the Meuse died less from a single battle than from a series of ambushes and fuel failures that left its last tanks abandoned. In each case, the decisive factor was not one spectacular duel, but cumulative friction applied by thousands of small, disciplined acts. Civilians were present throughout that chain, and 5 stand out in the American story surrounding the winter in Alsace. A farmer taught a welder how to cut hedge banks. A French blacksmith and his apprentices scaled that idea into dozens of cutters in 2 days, because they understood heat and quench by feel rather than formula. A Midwestern engineer, who had never worn a uniform before 1942, wrote a repair manual that taught field shops to fabricate standard pins and bushings from scrap when supply ran short. A telephone lineman turned corporal surveyed lines under fire and strung insulated wire high through trees so that forward observers could switch between nets without moving their mouths from a handset. A radio amateur who had built crystal receivers on a kitchen table before. The war taught a battalion that microphone technique and short messages were the difference between talking and being heard. None of these people rode a tank to its grave. All of them helped create the conditions in which armor failed to arrive in time, failed to mass at the right place, or failed to live long in the wrong place. The Colmar pocket where Murphy fought was a place where tanks could die from absence as much as from penetration. German records list dozens of vehicles left behind because the front moved and recovery crews could not reach them. In a winter campaign, a damaged track becomes a write-off if you cannot tow the vehicle within hours, because frost locks the ground and ice swallows the road edge. In that environment, artillery that leaves crews stunned and infantry scattered accomplishes more than a perfect aim point at an armor plate. The American doctrine that grew across 1944 and early 1945 reflected that truth. Manuals revised after Normandy stressed that infantry and engineers must clear terrain features first to prevent anti-tank guns from surviving to hit tanks as they commit. The farmer's logic shows up again. Do not drive a heavy machine into a field you have not prepared. Break the lip, flatten the shelf, clear the ditch. Once you translate the advice from soil to war, you recognize it everywhere. It is there when Allied commanders in the Ardennes insist that bridges be blown in a schedule that creates pools of armor rather than a tide. It is there when patrols at night mark the solid ground across a frozen creek so that a half-track will not crack through in the morning and trap the column behind it. It is there when a lieutenant in Alsace regards a stealthy enemy not as a set of moving shapes he must kill, but as a clock he must slow. The story returns to the young Texan because he embodies the last part of the thesis. Audie Murphy answered to a chain of command, but his judgment under fire derived from a childhood where weather had no respect for plans. A person who grows up on 70 acres of marginal land learns to live inside disadvantage. The army taught him weapons and procedures. His mother and the soil taught him what to do when the weather changed before the seed was in the ground. The same combination of discipline and improvisation appears in the civilians who taught the army new habits. When Sergeant Coulin showed his first hedgerow cutter to General Omar Bradley in July 1944, the general did not laugh at farm logic. He ordered cutters built by the hundreds. Welding crews cut steel from beach obstacles, from German wreckage, from anything that would take a bead. In the space of a week, divisions moved from complaint to capability, and the farmland itself became a tool. Opponents tried to adapt. German gun crews began to mine the banks where cutters would bite. Panzer commanders set their ambushes deeper in fields to avoid being pinned by infantry surging through the first breach. The counterplay increased the tempo at which American units had to learn. And that tempo could only be sustained because the machine shops were full of people who had practiced learning on the clock long before they wore boots. Here, the normalized metric is not tanks destroyed per day, but days from problem to prototype. In Normandy, that number was roughly 7, between identification of the cutter concept and widespread fielding, which, in a theater measured by corps frontage, is a blink. On the Colmar front, the metric becomes minutes from first contact to the first corrected artillery burst. On January 26, Murphy compressed that number to fewer than 5 by calling fire within seconds of the initial sighting and keeping corrections tight and plain. His act is heroic because it was sustained across nearly an hour under shrapnel and flame. Its importance is practical because it proved that a position anchored in communications and terrain can stall combined arms. That lesson was applied in dozens of places where unnamed lieutenants lasted 10 minutes instead of 50. Yet those minutes still pulled the thread from a larger attack and reduced its mass by the time it reached the next crossroad. The idea in the title that civilians took out nearly 300 German tanks makes a better poster than a history. But it points toward a truth the numbers support when counted at campaign scale. By late summer 1944, German armored formations in the West were losing vehicles faster than they could be replaced. At rates of dozens per week per division. The causes stack like the layers of a field. Air attack destroyed some guns, destroyed others. Many were abandoned or scuttled when fuel and recovery failed. Behind those failures stood a fabric of small innovations, many of them civilian in origin, which converted terrain and time into weapons. A hedgerow cutter changes a landscape. A better field telephone net changes the speed at which 1,000 men can share a thought. A repair technique learned in a farm shop turns a broken mount into a working gun in an afternoon instead of a week. When those changes accumulate across months, they equate to hundreds of armored fighting. Vehicles that were not where German plans needed them to be. The winter morning at Holtzwihr ends with the sound of the machine gun finally falling silent, and the steam from the M10's ruined engine drifting into the tree line. The men who had huddled behind the ditch line began to move again. They sorted ammunition, checked for wounded, and looked at the road the enemy had tried to take. The lieutenant climbed down and reorganized his company for a counterattack, because holding at one point means nothing unless it is linked to movement elsewhere. Behind them, the wire on the trees still hummed with artillery traffic. In shops miles to the rear, welders were laying beads on steel noses that would break more banks. In barns throughout France, farmers who had lived their lives reading soil told soldiers where the ground would carry a track and where it would swallow one. If you are looking for a miracle, that is where to find it. Not in a single man standing alone, but in civilians and soldiers together, turning ordinary knowledge into an edge. The legacy of that winter is not a legend of impossible numbers, it is a practical lesson. When doctrine fails on contact with ground and weather, the winning side is not the one with the thicker book. It is the one that can listen, learn, and change the ground under the enemy faster than he can change his plan. A Texas kid with a field telephone and a machine gun did that under fire. A handful of civilians across a continent did it with torches and wire and words. The result is measured not only in days taken off a campaign or miles gained on a map, but also in the armored hulls that never arrived. That is how an impossible strategy becomes visible to history. It is not the headline about a farmer and 4 friends destroying 300 tanks. It is the quieter arithmetic in which the habits of farms and shops changed how a modern army fought. And through those habits, hundreds of machines designed to dominate the field failed to do so at the hours that mattered. This is why the scene in Alsace deserves to open the story. A soldier, raised by hard land, faced a problem that looked like iron and found answers in time and terrain. The myth that grew after the war tells us how badly we want clean victories and single causes. The record offers something better. It shows us a web of skill that joined people who thought they had nothing in common. From French farmers to American welders to farm boys with radios. Their work did not look like glory at the moment. It looked like fixing the ground so that when the enemy arrived, he did not find what he expected. That is the true form of an impossible strategy, and that is how tanks die without a shot the morning before or the afternoon after. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.